Welcome to Chicago. The year is 1930. You've just stepped into one of the most dangerous, exciting, and utterly fascinating cities on the face of the earth. This is not just any American metropolis. This is the city that refuses to play by the rules. The place where fortunes are made in the shadows, and where the line between businessman and criminal has become so blurred that even the cops can't tell the difference anymore. Chicago in 1930 is home to 3.4 million people, making it the second largest city in the United States, right behind New York. And let me tell you something. This city has an attitude. It's loud, it's ambitious, it's ruthless, and it never, ever sleeps. The skyline is already impressive, with buildings reaching toward the heavens as if trying to escape the chaos happening at street level. But here's what makes this particular moment in history so extraordinary. Prohibition is in full swing. The 18th Amendment has made it illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport alcoholic beverages anywhere in the country. And yet, if you know where to look, and trust me, it's not hard to find, there are more than 10,000 speakeasies operating in this city right now. That's 10,000 secret bars, hidden behind unmarked doors, serving whiskey, gin, and beer to anyone with a few dollars and a willingness to break the law. The entire city is drinking illegally, and somebody has to supply all that liquor. That somebody has made Chicago famous around the world, and not for its architecture. Just 14 months ago, something happened here that shocked the entire nation. On February 14, 1929, St. Valentine's Day, 7 men were lined up against a wall in a garage on North Clark Street. What happened next became known as the St. Valentine's Day Incident, and it sent a clear message to everyone in America. Chicago had become the capital of organized crime, and one man sat at the very top of that empire. His name was on everyone's lips. His face was in every newspaper. He was feared, respected, and in some strange way, even admired. But as we walk through these streets in 1930, that man is at the absolute peak of his power, and he has no idea that his downfall is already being planned in a government office just a few miles away. The Chicago you're about to explore is a city of extreme contrasts. On Michigan Avenue, wealthy families stroll past luxury department stores dressed in the finest fashions from Paris and New York. Women wear fur coats and cloche hats, men sport tailored suits and polished shoes, and everyone pretends that the world isn't falling apart around them. Because here's the thing. The stock market crashed just a few months ago, in October of 1929. Fortunes were wiped out overnight. Banks are failing. Unemployment is starting to rise. But if you walk down Michigan Avenue in 1930, you'd never know it. The rich are still rich, at least for now, and they're determined to enjoy it while it lasts. But venture a few blocks in any direction, and the picture changes dramatically. In the neighborhoods south and west of downtown, working-class families are packed into cramped tenements, 6 or 7 people sharing 2 rooms. Factory workers put in 12-hour shifts for wages that barely cover rent and food. Immigrants from Poland, Italy, Ireland, and a dozen other countries have built tight-knit communities where everyone knows everyone, where churches and taverns serve as the centers of social life, and where people look out for each other because nobody else will. This is a city run by contradictions. The mayor, William Thompson, everyone calls him Big Bill, is one of the most colorful and controversial figures in American politics. He's loud, he's flamboyant, and he's been accused of having very close ties to the criminal underworld. Some say he's on the payroll. Others say he simply looks the other way in exchange for support during elections. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. Under Big Bill Thompson's leadership, Chicago has become a city where crime doesn't just exist, it thrives. The police force is riddled with corruption. Judges can be bought. Politicians attend parties thrown by known criminals. And the man who controls most of that criminal empire? He operates openly, almost brazenly, from his headquarters at the Lexington Hotel on South Michigan Avenue. He gives interviews to reporters. He attends baseball games and opera performances. He even opened a soup kitchen to feed the poor during these hard economic times. To some, he's a villain. To others, he's a folk hero, a man who provides jobs and services that the legitimate economy cannot. But make no mistake, behind that carefully crafted public image lies an operation built on bootlegging, gambling, and violence. An operation worth an estimated $100 million a year. That's equivalent to well over $1 billion in today's money. And every single dollar of it flows through one man's hands. As you stand here on the streets of Chicago in 1930, watching the elevated trains rumble overhead and the Model T Fords rattle past, you're witnessing the peak of an era that will never come again. The jazz clubs are packed every night. The speakeasies are doing record business. The criminal empire seems untouchable, invincible, eternal. But history has a way of surprising everyone. That man in the Lexington Hotel, the one who seems to control everything and everyone, he's about to learn a very hard lesson. Sometimes, the most powerful enemies aren't the ones carrying guns. Sometimes, they're the ones carrying calculators. To understand how this empire worked, you have to understand the man who built it. Alphonse Gabriel Capone arrived in Chicago in 1920, just a young man from Brooklyn with a scarred face and a talent for organization. Within a decade, he had constructed the most sophisticated criminal operation the United States had ever seen. This wasn't some small-time racket run out of a back alley. This was a genuine business empire, complete with accountants, lawyers, distribution networks, and a payroll that included hundreds of employees. The bootlegging operation alone was staggering in its scope. Capone controlled breweries, distilleries, and warehouses scattered across the city and its suburbs. He had trucks running liquor shipments around the clock, supplying those 10,000 speakeasies with beer, whiskey, and wine. But alcohol was just the beginning. The organization also ran gambling houses, where Chicagoans could bet on horse races, play cards, or try their luck at roulette. There were nightclubs and dance halls, legitimate-looking businesses that served as fronts for the real money-making operations happening in back rooms. And of course, there were the protection rackets, businesses that paid a monthly fee to ensure that nothing unfortunate would happen to their establishments. By 1930, conservative estimates placed the organization's annual revenue at $100 million, an almost incomprehensible sum at a time when the average American worker earned less than $2,000 a year. Capone himself lived like royalty, wearing custom-tailored suits, smoking expensive cigars, and traveling in a bulletproof Cadillac that had cost over $20,000. The headquarters of this empire was the Lexington Hotel, a massive brick building on South Michigan Avenue, where Capone occupied an entire floor. From this command center, he conducted business with the calm efficiency of a corporate executive. He held meetings, reviewed financial reports, and made decisions that affected thousands of lives across the city. The hotel was heavily guarded at all times, with armed men stationed in the lobby, the hallways, and even on the roof. Visitors were searched before being allowed upstairs. Phone lines were monitored. Nothing happened at the Lexington without Capone knowing about it. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his operation was not the money or the muscle, it was the corruption. Capone had built a network of influence that reached into every corner of Chicago's power structure. Police officers received regular payments to look the other way. Detectives warned him about planned raids before they happened. Judges dismissed cases or handed down lenient sentences. Politicians attended his parties and accepted his campaign contributions. It was an open secret that City Hall and the criminal underworld were deeply intertwined, and Capone was the spider sitting at the center of that web. He seemed untouchable, protected by layers of bribery and intimidation that no local authority could penetrate. But there was one group of men who refused to play by Chicago's corrupt rules. In 1930, a young federal agent named Eliot Ness assembled a team of investigators who became known as the Untouchables, a nickname they earned because they couldn't be bought. While most law enforcement officials in Chicago had their hands out, Ness and his men were different. They were federal agents, which meant they answered to Washington, not to City Hall. They couldn't be fired by local politicians or intimidated by local criminals. And they had a specific mission: to gather evidence of Prohibition violations that could be used to prosecute Capone in federal court. The Untouchables conducted raids on breweries and warehouses, seizing equipment and documenting the scale of the bootlegging operation. They intercepted shipments, arrested drivers, and slowly built a case that linked the illegal alcohol trade directly to Capone's organization. But here's the twist that makes this story so fascinating. It wasn't the Untouchables who ultimately brought down the empire. While Ness was kicking down doors and smashing barrels, another team of federal investigators was quietly doing something far more devastating. They were examining financial records. The Internal Revenue Service had been investigating Capone's finances for years, and they had discovered something remarkable. Despite living in obvious luxury, despite the mansions and the cars and the expensive suits, Capone had never filed an income tax return. He had never paid a single dollar in federal taxes on his enormous illegal income. And in 1931, the government decided that this was how they would finally take him down. Not for bootlegging, not for the violence, not for the corruption, but for tax evasion. In June of 1931, a federal grand jury indicted Capone on 22 counts of income tax evasion, charging that he owed the government over $200,000 in back taxes. It seemed almost absurd. The most powerful criminal in America, the man who had orchestrated countless acts of violence and built a $100 million empire, was being prosecuted for not paying his taxes. But the evidence was overwhelming. The accountants had done their work. The paper trail was clear, and on October 17, 1931, after a trial that captivated the entire nation, Alphonse Capone was found guilty and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. The man who had seemed invincible, who had corrupted an entire city, who had lived like a king for more than a decade. He was brought down not by bullets or badges, but by balance sheets. As he was led away in handcuffs, the era of the celebrity gangster in Chicago began to fade. The throne was empty, and nothing would ever be quite the same. With the empire's leader behind bars, you might think that Chicago would have breathed a sigh of relief, that the city would have finally turned a corner toward law and order. But the truth is far more complicated. By 1932, Chicago was fighting a battle on a completely different front, a battle against poverty, hunger, and despair that made the gangster wars seem almost trivial by comparison. The Great Depression had arrived in full force, and it was devastating this city like nothing else in living memory. The stock market crash of 1929 had been just the beginning, a tremor before the earthquake. Now, 3 years later, The true scale of the catastrophe was impossible to ignore. Factories that had once employed thousands of workers stood silent and empty, their smokestacks cold, their gates padlocked. The meatpacking plants along the South Side, which had made Chicago the butcher to the world, had cut their workforce by more than half. Steel mills, machine shops, and manufacturing plants had either closed entirely or were operating at a fraction of their capacity. The unemployment rate in Chicago had reached a staggering 40%. 4 out of every 10 workers had no job, no income, and no prospects. Men who had spent their entire lives providing for their families now stood in bread lines that stretched around entire city blocks, waiting hours for a bowl of soup and a piece of bread. The dignity of work had been replaced by the humiliation of charity, and for many proud Chicagoans, this was a wound that cut deeper than any economic hardship. The streets of Chicago in 1932 told a story of profound suffering. Along the lakefront and in vacant lots throughout the city, makeshift camps had sprung up. Clusters of shacks built from scrap wood, cardboard, and corrugated metal, where families who had lost everything tried to survive another day. People called these camps Hoovervilles, a bitter joke aimed at President Herbert Hoover, whom many blamed for the economic disaster. Thousands of Chicagoans lived in these desperate settlements, cooking over open fires, sleeping under threadbare blankets, watching their children grow thin and pale from hunger. The contrast with the glamorous Chicago of just a few years earlier could not have been more stark. Those speakeasies that had once overflowed with laughter and illegal champagne, many of them had closed, their customers unable to afford even bootleg liquor anymore. The jazz clubs that had made Chicago famous, half empty on most nights, the musicians playing for tips that barely covered their meals. Even the criminals were feeling the pinch. It's hard to run a protection racket when the businesses you're supposedly protecting can barely keep their doors open. And yet, in one of history's strangest ironies, the man who had profited most from Chicago's lawlessness became one of the few people actually trying to help. Before his imprisonment, Capone had opened a soup kitchen on South State Street that served 3 meals a day to anyone who showed up. At its peak, this kitchen was feeding more than 3,000 people every single day, more than any government program or private charity in the city. It was a public relations move, certainly, an attempt to polish his image and win the sympathy of the common people. But for the hungry men, women, and children who lined up outside that kitchen, the motivation didn't matter. A hot meal was a hot meal, regardless of who was paying for it. Life for the ordinary people of Chicago during these years was a constant struggle for survival, a daily negotiation between hope and despair. A typical working-class family, if the breadwinner was lucky enough to still have a job, might earn $15 or $20 a week, barely enough to cover rent, food, and coal for the stove. Housing conditions in the immigrant neighborhoods were often deplorable, with entire families crammed into 2 or 3 rooms, sharing a single bathroom with multiple other families in the same building. In winter, the cold was brutal and relentless, with temperatures dropping well below zero and winds howling off Lake Michigan with a ferocity that seemed personal, almost vengeful. Families huddled around coal stoves, wearing multiple layers of clothing indoors, stuffing newspaper into the cracks around windows to keep out the drafts. Disease spread easily in these crowded conditions. Tuberculosis, influenza, and childhood illnesses claimed thousands of lives every year, particularly among the poor who couldn't afford proper medical care. And yet, despite all this hardship, there were reasons to keep going. Small joys that made life bearable even in the darkest times. The radio had become a lifeline, bringing music, comedy shows, and news into homes that couldn't afford any other entertainment. Families gathered around the radio in the evenings, losing themselves for a few hours in the adventures of their favorite programs. The movie theaters offered another escape, charging just a dime or 15 cents for admission to a world of glamour and excitement that seemed impossibly far from the breadlines outside. Neighborhoods maintained their close-knit character, with churches, social clubs, and ethnic organizations providing support networks that helped families through the worst of the crisis. People shared what little they had, looked after each other's children, and maintained a sense of community that no economic disaster could completely destroy. And then, in December of 1933, something happened that changed everything. The 21st Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, and Prohibition, that noble experiment that had shaped American life for nearly 14 years, came to an end. The news spread through Chicago like electricity, and for the first time in years, the city had something to genuinely celebrate. Legal alcohol could be sold again. The speakeasies could come out of the shadows and become legitimate bars and taverns. The bootleggers, the rum runners, the entire criminal infrastructure that had been built around illegal liquor, all of it became obsolete overnight. People poured into the streets, drinking openly and legally for the first time since 1920. Bars that had operated in secret for years threw open their doors and hung out signs advertising their presence. It felt like the end of an era, because it was. The world that had created the gangster empires, the world of secret passwords and hidden doorways and corrupt cops looking the other way, that world was disappearing. Chicago was still struggling, still poor, still fighting its way through the Depression. But something had shifted. The rules of the game had changed, and everyone knew it. The question now was, what would come next? The end of Prohibition had removed the foundation upon which the great criminal empires had been built, but it would be naive to think that organized crime simply disappeared from Chicago. The outfit, as Capone's organization came to be known, continued to operate under new leadership, adapting to the changed landscape with the same ruthless efficiency that had always characterized it. Frank Nitti, who had served as Capone's chief enforcer, stepped into the role of day-to-day leadership, steering the organization away from bootlegging and toward gambling, labor racketeering, and other enterprises that didn't depend on a constitutional amendment for their profitability. The machine kept running, but it ran more quietly now, more carefully, with less of the flamboyant violence that had made the 1920s so notorious. The new leaders understood something that Capone, in his arrogance, had failed to grasp: that attracting too much attention was bad for business. The era of the celebrity gangster, the criminal who gave interviews to newspapers and posed for photographs at baseball games, was coming to an end. The smart money was on keeping a low profile, corrupting officials quietly, and avoiding the kind of spectacular incidents that brought federal investigators to town. But if Chicago's homegrown criminals were learning discretion, the same could not be said for a new breed of outlaw that captured the nation's imagination during these years. The bank robbers had arrived, and they were unlike anything America had seen before. These were not sophisticated urban criminals running complex organizations. They were desperate men from the heartland, products of the Depression, who robbed banks with guns and getaway cars and seemed to be everywhere at once. And the most famous of them all, the man the newspapers called Public Enemy Number 1, met his fate on a Chicago street in the summer of 1934. John Dillinger had spent the previous year terrorizing banks across the Midwest, escaping from jail twice, and becoming a folk hero to millions of Americans who had lost their savings when those same banks had failed. To many ordinary people struggling through the Depression, Dillinger was a Robin Hood figure, a man who was taking from the institutions that had taken everything from them. But to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and its ambitious director, J. Edgar Hoover, Dillinger was an embarrassment that had to be eliminated. On the night of July 22, 1934, federal agents received a tip that Dillinger would be attending a movie at the Biograph Theater on Lincoln Avenue. When he emerged from the theater after watching a gangster film, the irony was almost too perfect. Agents moved in. What happened next took only seconds. Dillinger reached for his weapon, and the agents opened fire. The most wanted man in America fell on the sidewalk outside the theater, and within minutes crowds had gathered to stare at the scene and dip their handkerchiefs in the aftermath, seeking souvenirs of the outlaw's final moments. It was a turning point, not just for Chicago, but for the entire country. The message was clear. The federal government would no longer tolerate the romanticization of criminals. The era of the outlaw hero was over. Chicago was trying desperately to reinvent itself during these years, to shed its reputation as the crime capital of America and present a new face to the world. The Century of Progress International Exposition, which had opened in 1933 and continued through 1934, was part of this effort, a massive World's Fair celebrating Chicago's centennial and showcasing technological innovations that promised a brighter future. Millions of visitors came to see exhibits on science, industry, and modern living, walking through pavilions that imagined a world of flying cars, robot servants, and cities of gleaming towers. For a few hours, fairgoers could forget about the breadlines and the foreclosures and the grim headlines, losing themselves in visions of tomorrow. The fair was a success, bringing much-needed tourism dollars into the city and reminding Americans that Chicago was more than just gangsters and corruption. New political leadership was also making a difference. Mayor Edward Kelly, who took office in 1933, worked to distance City Hall from the criminal underworld that had flourished under Big Bill Thompson. The police department underwent reforms, federal cooperation increased, and while corruption certainly didn't disappear, it became less brazen, less openly tolerated. The city was cleaning itself up, slowly and imperfectly, but unmistakably. By 1936, Chicago was still tough, still gritty, still struggling with poverty and crime. But it was no longer the lawless frontier it had been just a few years earlier. The gangster era, that extraordinary period when criminals had operated almost openly and corrupted an entire city, was fading into history, but it would never be forgotten. The names, the stories, the legends, they had already become part of American mythology, destined to be retold in books and films for generations to come. Nearly a century has passed since those extraordinary years when Chicago stood at the center of America's most dramatic experiment with crime and prohibition. The city that exists today bears little resemblance to the chaotic, corrupt, and endlessly fascinating place we've been exploring. Modern Chicago is a gleaming metropolis of nearly 3 million people, a global center of finance, culture, and commerce, with a skyline that ranks among the most impressive in the world. The elevated trains still rumble through downtown, but now they carry commuters to corporate headquarters and tech startups rather than to speakeasies and gambling dens. The old immigrant neighborhoods have transformed, gentrified, diversified, their character changed by decades of migration and urban renewal. And yet, if you know where to look, you can still find traces of that vanished world, echoes of an era that refuses to be completely forgotten. The Green Mill Cocktail Lounge still stands on Broadway, the same jazz club where Capone once had his favorite booth, and where performers knew better than to stop playing when the boss was in the house. Walk through those doors today, and you're stepping into living history, a place where the ghosts of the 1920s and 30s seem to linger in the cigarette-stained walls and the worn leather seats. The Biograph Theater, where Dillinger met his end on that hot July night, still operates as a venue for live performances. Its marquee a reminder of that fateful evening when federal agents waited in the shadows, and an era came to a violent close. Other landmarks have not survived the passage of time. The Lexington Hotel, that fortress of criminal power where Capone held court and ran his empire, stood for decades as a deteriorating monument to a darker age before finally being demolished in 1995. The garage on North Clark Street, where the St. Valentine's Day incident took place, was torn down in 1967, though the bricks from its rear wall were salvaged and sold to collectors around the world, each one supposedly carrying the weight of history within it. The speakeasies, those thousands of hidden bars that defined the Prohibition experience, have almost entirely disappeared, replaced by legitimate establishments that serve their cocktails openly and legally. But their influence lives on in the craft cocktail renaissance that has swept through American cities, in the reverence for classic drinks and secret recipes that traces directly back to those years when bartending was an underground art. The architecture of the era remains Chicago's greatest physical legacy. Those magnificent Art Deco skyscrapers, those grand movie palaces, those sturdy brick apartment buildings that still house families in neighborhoods across the city. When you look up at the Chicago skyline, you're seeing a monument to the ambition and energy of the 1920s and 30s, built with money that came from both legitimate and illegitimate sources, a physical record of an age when Chicago believed it could become the greatest city in the world. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of this era is not found in buildings or landmarks at all. It lives in the stories, the myths, the endless fascination that continues to draw people to this chapter of American history. The gangster era gave us some of the most compelling characters in our national mythology. Flawed, dangerous, larger-than-life figures who have been immortalized in countless books, films, and television series. From the original Scarface to The Untouchables, from Road to Perdition to Boardwalk Empire, the stories of Prohibition-era Chicago have been told and retold, each generation finding new meaning in these tales of ambition, corruption, and downfall. There's something deeply American about these narratives, something that speaks to our complicated relationship with success, with wealth, with the tension between individual freedom and social order. The gangsters were villains, certainly, responsible for violence and suffering that affected thousands of lives. But they were also, in their own twisted way, entrepreneurs, men who saw an opportunity created by a misguided law and built empires by giving people what they wanted. Their story is a cautionary tale about what happens when government tries to legislate morality, when prohibition creates black markets that only criminals can fill. It's also a story about the limits of power, about how even the mightiest can be brought low by their own arrogance and by forces they never saw coming. Chicago survived the gangster era, just as it has survived everything else that history has thrown at it. The Great Fire, the Depression, the decades of industrial decline and urban crisis that followed. The city endures because its people endure, because generation after generation has chosen to make their lives here, to build families and businesses and communities in this place by the lake. When you walk down Michigan Avenue today, past the luxury shops and the tourists and the street performers, you're walking on ground that was once ruled by criminals and corrupted officials, where fortunes were made and lost, where history was written in headlines that shocked the world. The ghosts are there if you look for them, in the old photographs displayed in museum exhibits, in the stories told by tour guides leading groups through the city's historic districts, in the names that still carry a certain dark glamour after all these years. Chicago in the 1930s was dangerous, corrupt, and often cruel. But it was also vibrant, ambitious, and utterly alive. A city that refused to apologize for what it was. That spirit hasn't disappeared. It's still here, still animating this remarkable place, still driving the people who call Chicago home to build something greater than what came before. The gangster era ended, but Chicago's story continues, one chapter flowing into the next, an endless narrative of reinvention and resilience. And that, perhaps, is the greatest legacy of all.